Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. For the last 17 years, Israel has been out of the Gaza district, having unilaterally left it under Palestinian rule. For 15 of those years, Hamas has controlled this narrow territory and its 2 million inhabitants. And for 11 of those, the leader of the Islamist Hamas, and therefore Gaza, has been Yahya Sinwar, a devout Islamist operative, which Israel released from jail in a prisoner exchange deal. While Hamas maneuvers carefully not to trigger another major Israeli operation against it, Sinwar has inspired terror attacks by individuals penetrating Israeli cities from the West Bank, and part of the frustrated public response was a call to renew the tactic of targeted killings, with chief focus on abruption of Sinwar's timeline. Has that helped de-escalate the situation, or only pushed Sinwar to show that he cares for the Palestinian and Muslim causes more than he does for his own personal safety? Joining us from Central Israel for today's discussion is Colonel in Reserve Dr. Anan Wehbi, who is a senior fellow at the ICT at Reichman University and a lecturer as well at Haifa University. Thank you for joining us, Colonel.
Yeah.
Also joining us from northern part of Israel is Dr. Fadi Ismail, who is a research fellow at the Institute for Counterterrorism at Reichman University as well. Thank you for joining us as well, sir.
Thank you.
And joining us here in the studio is our TV7 editor-at-large and host of both Watchmen Talk and Powers in Play, as well as so much more, Mr. Amir Owen. Amir, give us a broader understanding on the current state of play when we're speaking about the Gaza Strip.
Jonathan, please indulge me for a second, as if you have a choice. It brings to mind crime and punishment. Sinwar is composed of sin and war. The sin was, of course, releasing him in the Gilad Shalit deal without making sure that Israel could find in him an interlocutor with which to cut a deal, a much broader deal regarding a longer armistice, if not peace, in Gaza. Peace is probably impossible with a militant Islamic organization bent on the destruction of Israel. And what happened was that following some 4 or 5 major operations over the last 13 years or so, Israel has gotten used to some periods of quiet and then broken by rockets, salvos of rockets being launched into Israel. Interestingly enough, you can't find right now a vacant apartment or a house in the Israeli villages and towns around Gaza. Many young Israeli families bet on the larger picture of being quiet along the border, again, broken by a day, 2 days, a week of an exchange. But this is no solution, of course. And Israel is now, in a way, captive to Sinwar's, whatever you want to call it, decisions or whims. And Sinwar has also managed to portray himself as the guardian of Jerusalem, of the holy part, the Muslim holy places, and he threatens Israel that if its behavior or the way the police conducts itself in East Jerusalem displeases him, he will restart his rocket campaign. So Israel is treading a very fine line, of course, not wishing to be subjected to deterrence, but also not wishing to escalate.
Indeed. Well, I'd like to ask this point and a couple more points. Dr. Wehbe, when we're talking about Yahya Sinwar, he was characterized, to me at least, by members of the Israel Security Agency, Shin Bet, as a very astute individual, a very devout Muslim, one of the students of the murderous leader or founding leader of the Islamist Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, who in 83 actually was one of those individuals as a student of Yassin, excuse me, Ahmed Yassin. Sinwar signed actually the proclamation calling for an Islamic jihad, a Muslim holy war for the liberation, quote of quote unquote, of Jerusalem and Israel at large. What was the thought behind Israel's thought process, if you will, with regard to releasing him in part of the deal for securing the release of Gilad Shalit, which, of course, in addition to Yahya Sinwar, there were 1,000 and several more thousands that, or dozens that were released for one Israeli troop.
Well, on the Israeli side, a lot of sides are talking a lot about that deal and why people like Sinwar should have been released, knowing that if we talk about the profile, psychological profiling of the man, he is really radical. He has a lot of experience. He, as you mentioned, was educated by Ahmed Yassin himself. He is religious, and he's talking about this war and this confrontation as a holy one. It's not. It's a lasting war, and it's an enduring hostility to the state of Israel. It's not about the understandings for the short run. It's only pragmatic. In the Israeli side, if we refer to the deal, the mindset was to release the soldier at that stage. And those who decided the numbers were together with the mediator, both sides. A lot of Israelis now asking whether if we should do again such a release of huge number, more than 1,000, 1,027 actually prisoners. Sinwar is getting much more radicalized right now. He is trying to change, first of all, the reality, the political, and especially the economic reality right now in Gaza Strip. He had promised his people there that he is going to bring some hope, jobs, to improve their life by using his military wing and threatening Israel and putting in front of them maybe some alternative to the way that this closure and the naval siege is still running by Israel, with not really a good success. Yahya Sinwar is part of the discussion inside Gaza Strip. A lot of young people, the younger generation, are rethinking again if this Mukawama model is the right one for them at this particular time, where the politics in the Middle East all over are changing, are shifting, and there are a lot of opportunities, and they are afraid that they might be put aside and they will miss this fantastic opportunity.
Just for the sake of our viewers who do not speak Arabic, Mukawama model, could you elaborate on that?
Mukawama model is part of this continuous struggle, of this enduring conflict between Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, and the house of the non-believers, of all other sides that are opposing the Islamic strategy. If we refer to Sayyid Qutb in particular, that wrote a lot about this issue in the 60s, this struggle must be learned, and there are stages referring, of course, to the original model of the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, and Sinwar is following those steps. Here, he might be preparing for the next stage and preparing the hearts and the minds of the new generation, trying to keep them. And it's not an easy job, because today the Mukawama model of just continue the preparation and acting whenever it's the right time it's not the same way that this global new generation is raising, and he is influenced by the smartphones from the globalization, values, and their dream might be a bit different than his. And he is trying also to convince his people that resilience also is very important. They have resilience is something that should be taught, and the society might be missing this issue because people are people, families are families. Everybody wants hope, want better life for his children, and Yahya Sinwar is not bringing this kind of hope. So his
Indeed.
model of Muqawama might be at risk.
Indeed. Dr. Ismail, I'd like to ask you, particularly when we're talking about the declaration of 83, in which Ahmad Yassin called for an Islamic jihad to reconquer, so-called, the areas, including Jerusalem in particular. His student, Yahya Sinwar, then sought to fulfill that call. One of the points of the Islamist Hamas, of course, within its charter, it's calling for the annihilation of Israel as part of that Islamic jihad, or the armed conflict of the Holy War, to reconquer the territories. But it does not speak particularly about Hamas. It speaks about all of the Dar al-Islam, or Islam, the Ummah, the nation of Islam, that should join together and work together in order to bring about that reality. How do you see the current international standing, specifically within the Arab world, for the Islamist Hamas organization, which remains a foreign terrorist organization recognized as such by the United States, by the European Union, and other EU member states, as well as other countries around the world? Do you see it as exclusively being backed by Muslim Brotherhood oriented states such as Qatar and Turkey, or is this now expanding as we see the Islamic Republic of Iran using its own proxy, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, to further its own interests in Gaza, and by doing so diminishing Hamas' capacity to direct its own political agendas?
This question plays right into the points that Sinwar himself brought up recently in a fiery exchange in the media, as well as one of his speeches. Speaking internationally, this is exactly how Sinwar sees the battle that he is engaged in. He sees it as an international battle, as a Dar al-Harb versus Dar al-Salam, or al-Ummah versus Dar al-Harb. And he said it openly that he, Hamas, is no more than the torchbearer for a fight that is it's a central fight for the Palestinian issue, as well as for all of Islam. So this is one thing he is promoting vis-a-vis the rest of the world that really matters to him, which is the Islamic world. I am the torchbearer for all of you for the most important issue. Okay, being a politician, and a very effective one at that, he walks a tightrope between these lofty words and the international reality that he's trying to play in. First of all, let's talk about what Hamas is doing internationally. He has outreach in many countries. I think somebody mentioned Turkey a few minutes ago. Of course, in Lebanon, we know that there was a rocket shot from Lebanon into Israeli territory during the recent incidents. He has outreach, of course. Recently, the Hamas, Gaza, made a strategic decision to become closer to Iran, not only Islamic Jihad, but actually Hamas. And that should have far-reaching outcomes. He has also outreach in other parts of the world, all the way to the Far East. Only very recently, maybe last month, we've heard about a success by Filipino security service by catching a Hamas organization in the Philippines, planning for operations against Israeli and Jewish targets over the world. Philippines. We know he has outreach also in Malaysia. We know he has a whole operation in Africa. I mean, he's becoming like Hezbollah in a sense. He operates all over the world, and as far and this way is becoming or trying to become a global player based upon the model of Hezbollah that is basically everywhere. Coming closer to home, also inside the 48, the Dakhil, or the inside, Hamas, or some people say that Sinwar was surprised by the reaction or the response of the Israeli Arab Street during May 2021, those incidents. And indeed, we identify a much more robust campaign that he has inside Israeli Arabs, trying to bring them more operationally into his work. We know that they are trying to reach into West Bank and East Jerusalem, not with a lot of success, except the area of Jenin. But there's one place that he is not engaging, and that is Gaza itself. I mean, he wants to work the whole world, the international arena, in his favor, but keeping Gaza outside possible military strikes from Israel. He simply cannot engage Gaza now with Israel, and that is an interesting thing. He's trying to move everybody around him, and even in his speech, he actually says it. Our front lines are Al-Aqsa, West Bank, Israeli Palestinians, Arab al-Dakhil, etc. But he wants to keep Gaza away from the actual operation. He simply cannot take another big military operation with Israel. That's a reality today, especially after Egypt, about a month and a half ago, decided to close the borders with Gaza for a lot of the commodities that they need. So now Sinwar, for all of his big talk, needs Israel even more than he did before. So we have a person here who's trying to walk this tightrope, and the international picture that you have, or the backdrop that you have described, plays right into it. Yeah, on one hand, the world is busy with the Ukraine, the United States is busy with China and Russia. There's way less attention to these kinds of fundamentalist or terrorist organizations, but that doesn't really help Sinwar a lot, because the only thing it means is that now Iran can have more outreach in the region, and I'm not sure this is a road that he wants to go down, because we've seen in Lebanon that once Iran puts its hand somewhere, it takes over. It doesn't just help for help, it becomes a major player, like it is in Lebanon right now, or in Syria. So they received, like we saw Lebanon here, where they received Iranian help, and next thing you know, they're basically run out of Tehran. So Sinwar is walking a very, very, very tight rope here. All of his options are pretty bad, and we didn't even start mentioning the troubles that he has within his own organization, within Hamas.
Indeed.
His other contestants for number one, and with the institutions, the party institutions. So he's in a very problematic place right now, but he can still cause a lot of damage as long as he manages to keep himself outside of Israeli military targeting right now. And this is where the whole conversation about whether or not to assassinate Sinwar plays into, because if we tell him actually the one place you don't want to see action in actually be the first place we will hit you, that really messes up all of his calculations. So not all news are bad news. We have also to say that some of the good stuff.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
Indeed. Just to clarify for the sake of our viewers again who do not speak Arabic, Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Salam, the one means, Dar al-Harb means the house of war, the other one, Dar al-Salam, means the house of peace. But
And Mukawama being resistance.
very good. Your Arabic is improving.
One word.
Indeed. Well, I mean, when we're talking about Israel in this context, it's looking at the current situation. It sees the Islamist Hamas organization increasing its capabilities, its international standing, for that matter, within the Arab world and the Persian world, for that matter as well. But We also see it diminishing somewhat of its capabilities. When we're looking about the rebuilding process, it's much more challenging at this stage when we're talking about the Gaza Strip. And also, one of its prime backers, if you will, because of its relations to the Muslim Brotherhood, has informed the pro-Turkish elements within Hamas. As Dr. Ismail has also alluded, there are different parties within the Islamist Hamas. Each one has its own patrons, whether it is the Islamic Republic of Iran, Qatar, Malaysia for that matter, and Turkey was one of those. And now Turkey has informed its somewhat stooges, I'd like to call them, but the Hamas operatives on its own territory, that they will not be allowed to operate against Israel from Turkish soil. To what degree is this because of the increased Iranian influence? And is this beyond that, or is this more about the rapprochement aspirations?
Well, that's probably it. If Turkey wants better relations with Israel, it cannot let Salah Haruri, the number 2 man in Hamas, and others have a free hand to plot against Israel from Turkish soil. But let's go back to basics for a moment, even though our viewers are quite knowledgeable. There is a century-old conflict between the Jewish national movement, which is now the Israeli national movement, and the Palestinian national movement. Now, Palestinians are, of course, Arabs. Most Arabs are Muslim. There is a Christian minority. But the Israeli national movement found some compromises with other Arab movements, the Egyptian one, the Jordanian one, the Lebanese, the Syrian, perhaps the Iraqi. Down the road, it conceivably can have peace with the entire Arab world based on territorial compromises. Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, which is not Arab, these are all militant Muslim movements, and they can see no compromise, especially not on what they consider holy Muslim soil, which is Palestine and especially Jerusalem. So there can be no long-standing solution between Israel and Hamas. And the only solution which Israel has seen was for Fatah, for the Palestinian Authority, to impose its will on Hamas. As long as Abu Mazen, who is ill and quite ancient, is in power, there will be no such imposition of Palestinian
Even
authority.
though when we're looking at the Palestinian towns and cities in the West Bank, the area of Jenin and Nablus, the Palestinian Authority has, quite frankly, lost control of those territories.
Yes, but
Not only from outside of its party, but from within its party,
Right.
an unloyal part of that.
well, yeah, that's how the violence of the year 2000 started, with Tanzim and Shabiba and other Fatah offshoots rather than Hamas and Jihad. And had there been free elections now in the West Bank, Hamas would have probably prevailed. So for Israel, which much earlier in the 80s, which you mentioned, thought to cultivate Hamas as a counterweight to Fatah, now it's obvious that there will be no peace with Hamas, and therefore Gaza will be out of the picture.
Indeed. Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, and each of you have about 1 minute and 20 seconds to provide your perspective for the near future. Where is the Gaza Strip currently heading? Is it going to continue to be not only a militant problem from where terrorist activity emanates from, but also a humanitarian one, as it's been since the Islamist organization took over back in 2006?
First of all, after hearing all what have been said right now, we should never underestimate Sinwar and his leadership right now in Gaza Strip. We should pay attention to the voices, the other voices that want better life and want stability and want a kind of hudna, no war, no peace right now. I think the next stage is not going to change the the reality from one side to another in Gaza. They will continue to be under blockade and some kind of military siege. But the Egyptian will play a central role. And we should remember the Arab countries, and in particular Egypt, do not want to see this model succeeding to achieve their political goals, because they are the brothers that are the opposition at home in Egypt and in other neighboring countries. They want
Indeed.
another model of secular military central regimes in the Arab countries. And I'm afraid that if this role will not be taken seriously by the Egyptians, and maybe a bit we will need the Qataris also to continue their role, even though we know that the Qatari money, the Qatari dollars had not helped a lot to stabilize Gaza. On the contrary, they are buying much more arms, etc. The next stage might be risky, but once again, maybe one more round, military for a short while, and then a long stability. Hopefully, we will not need it.
Indeed. Dr. Ismail, you have 40 seconds exactly.
When I ask myself what can make an opponent go to military option, I also apply it to Hamas. There are several things that can do this, mostly economic in nature or political, internal politics. At this stage, they know that they cannot conquer Jerusalem. This is an organization, I agree with Colonel Wehbi, this is an organization that weaponized kites, like children's toys. So they can really do a lot of things tactically speaking. It's just a question of the threshold to be crossed for them to have the need to go to military operation. I believe that if the money keeps on flowing, in the meantime, they will keep it like this.
This is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Dr. Wehbi, Dr. Ismail, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's panel. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.